Okay, next question. Love the show, guys. I'm wondering how often I should be doing FTP tests to keep my training zones accurate. I know testing too often can be stressful, but I also don't want to fall behind if my fitness is improving, and I actually find it very motivating to test and see that number rise. What's the ideal frequency for FTP testing, and are there signs that it's time to retest, even if it hasn't been that long? Also, maybe as it's coming into winter, this isn't what I should be focused on. Any help, much appreciated.
Yeah, it depends on kind of how you're setting up that macro training block.
Firstly, though, before you go into that, just for new listeners, explain what an FTP test is.
It's your functional threshold power test. So it's the number that we use, and we talked about this last week at length, how you test it and how you break it down. So we might link to last week's podcast if someone is unsure how to do it. But you're testing to set a line in the sand. Say, this is where my current fitness level is, and now you're going to set up your training zones as a percentage of the result of that. So your zone 1 is going to be like 55% of the power you could hold for 20 minutes multiplied by 0.95. And if your fitness changes, and now instead of holding 300 watts for 20 minutes, you can now hold 320 watts for 20 minutes. There's obviously a corresponding knock-on through all your zones. So you could be going out the door and training a little bit too easy because your fitness has improved. But I like to zoom out a little bit and think about how you structure a training season, like a macro cycle, or we call this, like, so the big bird's eye view of your training over the entire year. There's no difference on how you add intensity into your season. So basically 80% of your training should be easy, 20% should be harder. But then it doesn't matter if the 20% is added in a traditional periodization, reverse periodization, or randomly assigned intensity. So if we take something that I think works really well for time crunch riders, it's a reverse periodization. So that means we're going to have a 4-week block, and in that 4-week block at the start of the year, for 4 weeks, we're going to focus on sprinting. Now, for me, it makes very little sense to retest threshold at the end of a 4-week block because we haven't worked on threshold, we've worked on sprint. What makes a lot more sense is to test your sprint power at the start of the 4-week block. Now test your sprint power at the end of the 4-week block and see if you've had an increase in the variable that you've been trying to focus on. Then you move on to a VO2 block for 4 weeks, test your VO2 at the start, test your VO2 at the end of the 4-week block and see if you had a movement in your VO2. Then you move on to a threshold block, test your threshold to start, test your threshold at the end, see if you had that movement in your threshold power. So you can set your zones off the, you've multiple opportunities to set your zones then, because before you even start training, you might do a power profile test, which would include a 20-minute effort. And then when you're in your third block, you have a chance to reset them again off this threshold test. But there is some other sort of data you can look at as indicators if you wanted it throughout the block. If you're using Training Peaks and you see sustained high IF values, so that's IF's intensity factor. So if you're consistently completing workouts with an IF value of 1.0 or even between like 0.95 to 1.05 for longer efforts, that suggests your FTP is set a little bit low. Don't discount perceived effort as well. Like you said to me today, I felt amazing on the bike today. And perceived effort is really, really powerful. Like a lot of what we're trying to estimate from data and from wearables and from heart rate, it's like one step removed from how we feel. So if we can tap in and really understand how we feel, that's actually oftentimes a lot more valuable. Like if your threshold effort feels a lot easier, that's maybe my first indication to go, okay, my threshold effort feels a lot easier than it used to. Okay, now what's my heart rate at my old threshold power? Okay, my heart rate's also a little bit lower than it used to be at threshold. That can be a signal that you might need to retest. Or post-ride analysis, just looking through the data yourself and seeing, have you had 20-minute periods where your normalized power is closely aligned with your FTP? Because if you're having periods in the middle of a ride that are sub-maximum efforts, that are close to your previous maximum efforts, then you can kind of go, yeah, it could be time to retest that.
There's a range, though, within the zones, isn't there? Like, I mean, if this chap seems to love testing, he's some weird kind of sadist, but there is a range. You're not going to come in and out of those zones within a week or two, are you, or 3 weeks? No. I mean, there is quite a range within a zone.
There's a good range within the zone. You should fall within that bucket, but it might change if your coach is prescribing an upper zone 2 ride. Now might be a lower zone 2 ride, stuff like that.
Okay, amazing. Okay, next question. Anthony, I saw a Twitter post a few days ago talking about the 3 phases of periodization. What are they? The tweet didn't go into much detail. Can I self-coach this, or is it very complicated? And that's from Katie.
Coaching heavy rider support
Yeah, it
today,
is. It's
isn't
very, very, very training heavy.
It's like my voice is gone from this rider support. This, I don't know who initially came up with this. I always credit Joe Friel for this, but he definitely wasn't the original author of these ideas. I had Peter Leo on the podcast, who coaches the Australian team pursuit team. Actually, I don't think that's been released yet. Where's Peter Leo released? No,
I don't think so.
No, next week I think. Yeah. Could be next week or the week after. But that's an interesting one. We talk about the origins of some of this stuff, because some of it comes from other sports. The traditional phases of periodization we'd call are base phase, build phase, peak phase, and you could integrate taper into the peak. And base is kind of your foundational phase, where you're focused on endurance, strength, overall aerobic capacity, building mitochondria like we talked about. This is like lower intensity, high volume workouts. They're laying that foundation for the higher intensity stuff to come. This is like a traditional periodization we're talking about here. Build, here the focus shifts kind of to more developing power, speed, race-specific fitness. Workouts generally have a bit more bite to them, a bit more intensity with intervals, threshold type stuff. And then we're into the peak phase. This is the final phase leading up to competition. So each of these phases, a base could be base 1, 2, 3, could be 1 would indicate 4-week block. Base 2 will be a 4-week block. Base 3 will be a 4-week block. So you could have 12-week base phase before you start adding the 2 blocks of build, which would be another 8 weeks, and then into peak. And then you want to taper and then come back to the build phase to start again. Self-coaching's typically, back in my law days, they'd say the person who represents himself as a fool for a client. And it's kind of like that with coaching. You don't really want to coach yourself, because you've no objectivity around it. If you're feeling tired and you have to do 10 intervals and you're feeling tired 6 in, like, are you a quitter for not doing the last 4, or is it the smart thing? Having somebody that's totally removed and not invested in it will normally give you the right answer.
Yeah, I totally agree. That whole just little monologue you went through there sounded totally confusing to me, and I'm glad I have a coach.
Roadmen, are you ready for the world's greatest cycling show? Rouleur Live is back, and it's bigger than ever. From November 14th to 16th at the iconic Truman Brewery in London. Experience cycling culture brought to life. With over 80 of the world's top cycling brands and a star-studded lineup, it's the ultimate cycling event of the year. We're going to be accompanied by cycling royalty on stage. Tom Pidcock, Cassia Numadoma, Luke Rowe, Lachlan Morton, and even the legend Greg LeMond will be there sharing stories and inspiration. But tickets are selling really fast. The opening day is already sold out. There's limited tickets left available for Friday and Saturday. And for our Roadman listeners, you can get 10% off when you go to rouleur.cc/live and you use the code ROADMAN10. That's ROADMAN10. Go to Rouleur Live now and grab your tickets, and don't miss the cycling event of the year. And make sure to say hello if you see me there.